It wasn't just any day, and every detail was etched in Abigail's memory as if it had happened the night before. She had started her morning shift at the hospital, still reeling from that accumulated fatigue that doesn't go away even after sleep, because her body was already on autopilot after so many grueling days. During a short break, she picked up her phone to check her messages and saw a notification from her bank. Purchase approved $4,800 airline tickets. She felt an immediate chill in her stomach. Suddenly, her mind began to calculate. $4,800 wasn't an amount that went unnoticed in her budget, much less for something she hadn't purchased. She opened the details and there it was, 4 business class tickets to Hawaii. The passengers, her parents, her sister Kayla, and Derek, her brother-in-law. She didn't know whether to be more surprised by their audacity or by the confirmation of what, deep down, she had known for years. For them, she was their emergency wallet, always open. The night before, her mother had told her, as matter-of-factly as any woman could tell, that the trip cost about $1,200 per person and that if she couldn't afford it, she'd better stay. Abigail had swallowed, avoiding an argument because she already knew how such conversations would end. But seeing the purchase on her card, without her authorization, was a different story. In that moment, in the middle of the hospital cafeteria, she felt all the wear and tear of years crash down on her. She remembered every late rent she'd paid for Kayla, the medical bills for her father she'd covered, the repairs on Derek's car, every "I'll pay you back later" that never came true. This time, however, she wouldn't let it go. She took a deep breath, called the bank, blocked the card, and disputed the charge. Without fully realizing it, in that moment she'd begun to put an end to a story she'd allowed to drag on for far too long. After hanging up the call with the bank, Abigail felt a lump in her throat that wasn't just anger, but a mix of exhaustion and pent-up disappointment. For years, she had normalized this dynamic in which she was always the one who solved everyone's financial problems. She had done it out of love, loyalty, and even guilt, because her family made it a point to make her feel that if she could help, she should. But that morning, looking at the shopping log on her phone, she clearly understood that this wasn't help, but abuse. And the worst part was, it wasn't something new. She had simply reached a point where she could no longer ignore it. After finishing her shift, instead of going straight home as usual, she decided to stop by a quiet coffee shop where she could sit and think without interruptions. She turned on her laptop and began reviewing her own statements and old records. One by one, she wrote down all the payments she had made over the past few years for her parents, Kayla and Derek, medical bills, rent, insurance, large purchases, and even small expenses that, when added together, made a dizzying number. At that moment, she drafted a document with all those amounts, adding dates and terms as if it were a professional report. She knew it wasn't just for money, but to put on paper a truth everyone pretended not to see, that her generosity had been used like a bottomless bank account. That same afternoon, she sent the document to a family group via email and text message, accompanied by a brief but firm statement. From that moment on, she would not cover anyone's expenses anymore. There were no insults, no long justifications, just a straightforward list of everything she had paid and the clarity that this phase was over. Not even 10 minutes passed before the calls began. First her mother, with that tone laced with indignation disguised as concern, then Kayla, firing off reproachful messages about destroying the family. And finally Derek, who tried to downplay it all as a misunderstanding. Abigail didn't respond to any of them. Instead, she put her phone on silent and breathed, aware that the real challenge had just begun. The next few hours became an avalanche of contact attempts. Her doorbell rang twice, but she didn't open the door. From the window, she saw her father standing on the sidewalk, his hands in his pockets, avoiding looking at her directly. It was the first time in a long time that Abigail allowed herself not to react, not to give in. She saved screenshots of every message and logged every missed call. She knew that if they had been able to use her card without permission, she couldn't underestimate what they could do next. That instinct to protect herself, which she had never prioritized before, began to guide every step she took. The next day, while checking her emails, she found something she hadn't expected. A message from Marissa, Derek's ex-wife. They weren't close. They'd barely crossed paths at family gatherings, but the subject line made her open it. Immediately, important information about Derek. Inside, Marissa told her that, after their divorce, she'd continued receiving notifications about a joint bank account Derek maintained with his in-laws, Abigail's parents. She attached screenshots showing constant transfers to cryptocurrency gambling platforms, all made with money the family supposedly needed for emergencies. Abigail felt a mixture of disgust and relief. Finally, she had concrete proof that he wasn't exaggerating. With that information in hand, she spent the rest of the morning organizing everything: Marissa's screenshots, her own payment log, and the credit card statements for the tickets to Hawaii. She created a secure folder in the cloud and another on a flash drive that she kept out of the house, just in case. It wasn't just a matter of money. It was confirmation that her parents knew about the problem and had chosen to remain silent so as not to lose the support she represented. At that moment, sadness mingled with a determination she hadn't felt before. It was no longer about setting limits, but about closing the door permanently and legally protecting herself from any further maneuvers. That same afternoon, Abigail wrote a short, direct group message, attaching a couple of the most compelling pieces of evidence. She didn't do it with the intention of arguing, but rather to make it clear that she knew exactly what was going on. The silence that followed was different from previous times. No more frantic calls or constant messages, but a tense silence, as if everyone was calculating their next move. Still, she didn't let her guard down. She set up additional alerts on her bank accounts and requested a change of card number from the bank and the activation of a two-step verification system for all transactions. The next day, she received a certified letter from the bank confirming the opening of an investigation into fraud related to the ticket purchase. This official notification was an unexpected relief. It meant she was no longer relying solely on her word against theirs. She seized the opportunity and contacted a lawyer a colleague at the hospital had recommended sometime earlier, explaining the situation and providing all the documentation. The lawyer was clear: the more evidence she gathered and the more records she kept, the easier it would be to prevent them from using her information again without permission. For the first time in a long time, Abigail felt in control, even though the battle was just beginning. The following days were a constant exercise in self-control. At the hospital, her colleagues noticed that she was more serious than usual, although she continued to do her job without complaint. What no one saw was that, during every break, she checked her accounts and email, making sure there were no new surprises. Despite the tension, she began to feel a lightening of her chest. She had made a decision that she couldn't turn back, and although the emotional cost was high, every step she took to protect herself reinforced a certainty that she was doing the right thing. One afternoon, as she was leaving work, she saw Kayla's car parked in front of her building. The mere sight made her heart race. She decided not to go through the front door and walked around the block, hoping she would leave. She didn't want an impromptu confrontation in the middle of the street. When she finally arrived at her apartment, she found an envelope tucked under the door. Inside was a handwritten letter from her sister, alternating apologetics with veiled accusations that she was destroying the family. Abigail read it once and filed it away in the folder where she kept everything related to the case. She wasn't going to respond with explanations or justifications anymore. Any communication from that moment on would have to go through her lawyer. A week later, the bank's investigation officially confirmed that the ticket purchases had been made from Derek's personal computer. This information, along with the transfer history Marissa had sent him, formed a solid case. Abigail's attorney filed the documentation and requested precautionary measures to prevent any unauthorized use of her financial identity. It was at that moment that she realized that, although the family tried to disguise everything as a misunderstanding, the facts spoke for themselves, and there was no longer any room for emotional manipulation. That same evening, while she was having dinner alone in her apartment, she received an unexpected message from her father. He didn't apologize or try to smooth things over. It was a direct demand that she drop the complaint before things went too far. She read it calmly and, instead of replying, took a screenshot and filed it with the rest of the evidence. It became increasingly clear that the reconciliation calls were nothing more than attempts to save face and, above all, to protect Derek. That certainty, though painful, helped close any remaining doubts she might have had. As the days passed, the family's reaction became less open and more subtle. There were no direct visits or calls, but Abigail began to notice strange movements on social media, innuendo-filled posts, passive-aggressive comments from distant cousins, and even private messages from people she barely knew, asking her to think carefully about what she was doing. All of this reinforced her decision to remain closed and not explain herself to anyone outside of the legal sphere. She knew any emotional response would be used against her, so she limited herself to observing and documenting everything. It was in the midst of this climate that she received another call from Marissa, this time informing her that Derek had attempted to withdraw a significant sum from an account he still shared with Kayla. The irony was that the account was practically empty thanks to gambling and Derek's lack of a steady income. Abigail was grateful for the information and updated her lawyer. The web of lies and financial dependencies within her family was much deeper than she had imagined, and that gave her even more reason not to look back. For the first time, she began to think about what her life would be like without that constant weight on her shoulders. As the weeks passed, Abigail began to notice changes in her own mood. The stress was still there, but it was no longer the constant pressure that prevented her from sleeping or concentrating. She surprised herself by finding moments of true silence in her small apartment, without her phone vibrating constantly or the feeling that at any moment she would have to deal with another crisis of someone else's. She took advantage of this mental space to resume activities she had put aside years ago, going for morning runs again, cooking recipes she learned in college, and even reading a book without checking her phone every 5 minutes. It was as if, little by little, she was recovering a part of herself that had been buried under the obligations imposed by others. Despite that respite, there were days when guilt tried to creep in. She thought about past Christmases, family birthdays, all the times her help had prevented someone from becoming homeless or without medical treatment. But she quickly remembered that support was never reciprocated, and that even in her worst moments, like when she had to pay out of pocket for minor surgery and her bank account was nearly empty, no one in her family had offered any help. This reflection didn't harden her. On the contrary, it gave her a clarity she never had before. Helping can't be synonymous with nullifying yourself, and loving someone doesn't mean allowing yourself to be used. That certainty was becoming her best defense against any attempt at emotional manipulation. A month after that first card freeze, official notification arrived that Derek was being investigated for fraud. The bank had found transaction patterns that matched the documents Abigail had submitted, and that opened the door to a broader review of his financial activities. Although the news left her with a mixture of relief and sadness, she knew it was a necessary step. She didn't enjoy seeing a family member in legal trouble, but she understood that he was the one who had crossed that line, and that his silence in the past would only allow it to continue. That same day, she decided to do something she'd been putting off for a while. She started therapy. In the first session, she struggled to put into words the feeling of having been the provider from such a young age, of how her entire identity seemed to revolve around solving problems that weren't hers. The psychologist asked her to describe, with concrete examples, the times she felt her boundaries were ignored, and as she spoke, Abigail realized she could list dozens without even trying. She left the consultation with a heavy head, but also with a strange feeling of lightness, as if she had finally begun to empty a suitcase she'd carried full throughout her adult life. In the following weeks, Abigail maintained an almost surgical routine to preserve her peace of mind. She checked her accounts once a day, updated her lawyer only when there was news, and for the first time in a long time, didn't react immediately to every external stimulus. This space allowed her to focus more on her work at the hospital, where She also began to receive recognition that had previously gone unnoticed. Her colleagues noticed her willingness to help with complex cases and her ability to remain calm under pressure, qualities she'd always possessed, but which had previously been overshadowed by the chaos in her personal life. One Friday afternoon, as she was leaving her shift, she received an unexpected message from a former classmate who now ran a small scholarship program for young nurses. She invited her to become a mentor and share her experience managing personal finances in such a demanding profession. Abigail felt this was the kind of help that made sense, sharing what she had learned, not as a silent sacrifice, but as a tool to help others avoid the same thing. This proposal ignited an inner spark she hadn't felt in a while, and she accepted without a second thought. It was a reminder that her story, though marked by abuse, could also become a valuable resource for others. Participating in that mentoring program became one of the most positive turning points for Abigail. At first, she struggled to talk about her experience without feeling a pang of shame or anger, but she soon realized that the young nurses listening to her didn't judge her. On the contrary, many nodded in agreement, as if recognizing similar situations in their own lives. This sincere exchange, free from judgment and familial expectations, gave her a sense of community she had never experienced in her own home. She began to understand that true empathy and support don't always come from blood, but from the people who choose to be with her. Meanwhile, the investigation against Derek progressed. Her lawyer informed her that she would likely face formal charges, and that this could include partial reimbursement of the money Abigail had lost over the years. When the transfer finally arrived, a sum that, although considerable, didn't cover everything, she didn't hesitate. She allocated every dollar to the scholarship fund she supported, in honor of all the nurses who, like her, had supported entire families without receiving anything in return. It was a silent gesture, but one laden with personal meaning. It wasn't revenge. It was a way to transform a wound into something that could help others avoid falling into the same cycle. As the months passed, the lack of contact with her family stopped feeling like a void and began to feel like a much-needed respite. She no longer had to wait for accusatory messages or surprise visits, and she could plan her days without the fear that one call would upend her entire schedule. In therapy, she worked on the idea that setting boundaries didn't make her a bad daughter or sister, but rather someone who respects herself enough to not allow further abuse. That realization didn't come overnight, but each drama-free day confirmed that she'd made the right decision. One Sunday morning, while sipping coffee on the balcony, Abigail found herself thinking excitedly about the future. It wasn't a grandiose fantasy, but simple plans: traveling to a place she'd always wanted to visit, continuing to run in the mornings, expanding her mentoring work. Life still had its challenges, the hospital was still demanding, but now she felt like every effort she put in was being put into building something of her own, not filling in the gaps others had left. For the first time in years, she gave herself permission to imagine her life without other people's burdens, and that image felt more liberating than any apology she could have received. The final closure came almost a year after that day in the hospital, when she received a letter from her lawyer informing her that the case against Derek had concluded and that there was no longer any legal avenue for her family to access her financial information. Reading those words was like lifting a weight she still, somewhere, believed she was carrying. There was no loud celebration or need to share it with anyone. She simply filed the letter away in a folder and felt she could finally turn the page without fear of something happening again. That night, when she got home, she lit a candle and put on some soft music, something she hadn't enjoyed in a while. She cooked her favorite dish and ate dinner in peace, without her phone by her side. She didn't need to look back or justify her decisions. She knew she had done what she had to do to protect herself. She looked out the window and silently promised herself that she would never again allow anyone to take more from her than she was willing to give. She knew the path she had chosen wasn't easy, but she also knew that every step she took led her to a place where, finally, she could breathe and feel in control of her own life. Over time, the memory of that day when everything changed stopped hurting and became a point of reference. Abigail knew there would always be people who wouldn't understand her decision, who would point to her as selfish or ungrateful, but she also knew those opinions came from those who had never carried the weight she had carried for years. She learned not to waste energy explaining her side of the story to those who didn't want to listen. The important thing was that, every morning, she could look in the mirror and recognize herself without feeling like she was betraying her own limits. Today, her life is different. Not because she's erased the past, but because she stopped living to please others. She continues working at the hospital, continuing to help when she wants, but always from a healthy and chosen place. The scholarships she supports continue to grow, and with them, the certainty that her experience serves more than just a reminder of pain. Abigail doesn't consider herself a hero or a victim. She sees herself as someone who one day decided to lock a door and keep the key. And although that key weighs heavily on her, she knows it's the symbol of her freedom and of the life that now, finally, is completely hers.